I tell you, have me to follow Jack Bass.
How was your call in?
How y'all doing?
All right.
But Jack gave you a good backdrop on this state's history. And I guess it's up to us now to figure out how did the rural economy came out of that. And as a result, there is no rural economy to speak of. My good friend Bernie Mazik called me and asked me to come and talk to you about rural economy and the history of South Carolina. And I said to Bernie, you got the wrong person. I am not an economist nor a historian. But he insisted. He mentioned the name Dana Beach. And that got it. I'll follow that man anyway. I feel somewhat now after Jack has talked like the man who had died and gone to heaven, and the Lord had a conference asking everyone about the greatest experience they had witnessed on earth. And this particular fella had witnessed the Johnstown flood, Pennsylvania, and he knew that was the greatest flood ever on earth. And he was about to get up to tell the story, and someone pulled his coattail and said, I think you ought to know, Brother Noah is in the audience. So that's the way I feel being here talking about history and all these historians, and Jack Bass sitting right there behind me. So I don't know what to do. It's a good time to talk about history. This is the coming up what that big word, Jack? Sesquicentennial. And Jack and I, about the same age, we were born about 75 years after the end of the Civil War. And we have lived the other half of the 150 years. So we can talk a little bit about that. Half about that sesquicentennial. I thought I would say a few words about how that backdrop that Jack just talked about affected my experience in the rural South Carolina, and how it might have impacted in some way how the economy got shaped. And also more narrowly talk about us black folks who were in South Carolina during this time. You see, we were in some cases isolated 3 times in the South. We were isolated, some of us, on islands, in the wider scheme of things in the rural area, and also by race. And so you had this group of people, rural, islanders, racial minority. In one case, we were a majority in South Carolina. In the midst of all this that was going on that Jack talked about. And so that created another kind of economy that most of mainstream South Carolina probably didn't know about. You see, after the Civil War, there was a lot of purchase of land among black folks, particularly on the islands. For those of you who do not know, Hilton Head was about 20–25% owned by black folks. And along the coast, that was pretty prevalent for black people to own property after the Civil War. Now, despite Reconstruction, I mean the end of Reconstruction, people stayed on the land. But it was hot, lots of mosquitoes in some places, and no air conditioning, so folks took the train as fast as they could and migrated. So the Great Migration had an effect as well. And that economy grew because the Great Migration, after the folks got north, they sent money back. But in the main, folks stayed on the land in the rural South and worked the land. And one of the biggest impacts, I think, on South Carolina and the South was when Booker T. Washington pretty much accepted segregation. In 1895, he made that famous speech. Put down your bucket where you are. Meaning, go on, take care of yourself. Farm the land. Develop your own community. And of course, some folks didn't like that. And most of us thought that Booker T had sold us out. But in spite of that, most people stayed on the land and began to work. 1 year later, the Supreme Court made it official. You will be separate. But Booker T, one of those things in Booker T's speech that most people missed was Booker T said, we want all the privileges of the law. That means protection, that means equal education, that means everything. It never happened. But folks stayed on the land anyway and worked it. There's a book that was done way back in the 30s called Black Yeomanry. It's a book about people on St. Helena Island at the time, working the land, and how they took their 10, 15 acres and diversified their crops and pretty much farmed freely. And I think you could take that and pretty much apply it to many areas in the rural South, how people really took on their land and worked it. In the 1930s, over about a 7-year period on St. Helena Island, folks worked the land and made about $600–700 a year. Now, the folks in the city made a little more, but those folks who worked the land, could get a bushel of sweet potatoes for 1/2 less than the guy who had to buy it in the city. And so the produce and the vegetables cost less that they consumed. In addition to that, they could add, half of their wages could come from little carpentry work, midwifery. People did that kind of work. They had other skills that they did. And so between the 1900s and the 1930s, when we lost the cotton in the 1920s, from the 1900s until about the 1950s, that's what you had in rural